Hello, everyone. My name is Dustin Schwab, and I'm a career development specialist here at Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities, which we refer to as OOD. Today, I am co-hosting with my colleague, Julie Wood, and we'd like to welcome you to the Employer's Reasonable Accommodation Handbook six-part webinar series for the sixth session titled, What Can I Ask and Why? Julie, will you please introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Dustin, and hello, everyone. We appreciate you joining us. My name is Julie Wood, and I am OOD's Worksite Accessibility Specialist. I'm also an occupational therapist and a certified ADA coordinator. In my role, I provide education for employers that is focused on creating inclusive and accessible workplaces. This includes discussing the guidelines under Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. It includes identifying ideas to consider for reasonable accommodations and sharing best practices and guidance for making the workplace accessible.
Thank you, Julie. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that today's training comes with a learner's guide and a helpful fact sheet that can be accessed now through the link that is posted in the Q&A section here in Microsoft Teams. Just as a reminder, the information we share in these resources and during today's conversation is for educational purposes only and is not legal advice. But we do hope this information is helpful for you. We'll be stopping about halfway through today's presentation and then again before we conclude to answer questions. So please post your questions in the Q&A section at any time throughout the presentation so that they're ready for us when we stop. Julie, would you like to address the accessibility practices we have included in today's webinar?
Sure. We plan for accessibility from the start. For example, we use the accessibility checker that is built into Microsoft 365 to review the learner's guide, fact sheet, and PowerPoint. We address color contrast, font style and size, and add alternative text to visual images. Also, in our delivery, Dustin and I mention each other by name as our conversation goes back and forth. We do this intentionally to indicate who is speaking. This can be helpful when attendees are receiving this information through services like American Sign Language interpretation and live captioning. After the webinar, we edit the transcript and fix any captioning errors before uploading the webinar to our on-demand library. Taking these steps up front can make this presentation more accessible and inclusive for everyone.
All right, Julie, today's topic is what can I ask and why? As a naturally nosy person, I probably have a lot to learn. This title is maybe a little more abstract than some of our traditional webinar titles. We're going to discuss a range of topics today. So let's start by explaining the title of today's webinar. Can you review what we will be discussing related to what employers can ask?
Dustin, we are going to talk about what employers can ask and when related to disability-related questions and medical examinations during the hiring process and employment.
Great. Julie, what topics will cover the why portion of today's webinar?
We will focus on answering the why portion of today's webinar with our ongoing discussion of how knowing what to ask and when can impact fostering a disability-inclusive workplace culture. We will conclude by sharing guidelines for self-identification campaigns and then highlight how employers use disability-focused employee resource groups, which are known as ERGs, to support their inclusion efforts.
Thank you, Julie. I think that will help us understand the focus of today's webinar. So, not to be confusing, but I want to start with the why that you mentioned, creating a disability-inclusive culture. I think employers who access our webinars are interested in creating these types of cultures, so this may be a good place to start.
I agree, Dustin, and I think this begins with the awareness that work is important to all people, including people with disabilities. Each of us wants to have a sense of purpose, contribute to our financial needs, connect with others, and make a difference in our communities. And work can provide a way to fulfill these needs. Work can also be a productive and meaningful way to spend our time, which can contribute to our overall health and well-being. Because work is so important to us all, it's an important reason why employers strive to create inclusive cultures. They want to attract diverse employees who feel included and have the opportunity to fulfill their needs. Employees who feel valued and supported are productive employees and more likely to stay with an employer who has created this culture.
Julie, throughout the Employer's Reasonable Accommodation Handbook, we have shared employment stories of former OOD participants. Many of them expressed why work was important to them, so I thought we could share a few of these today.
That's a great idea, Dustin.
During our Neurodiversity in the Workplace webinar, we shared a story from Brandon. He said, "Work is important to me. I feel a personal calling to work so that I can help others in the community understand financial matters."
Dustin, during our webinar on intellectual disabilities, we shared a story about Zach. He said, "I like to work because it makes me like everyone else." And our physical disabilities webinar featured a story about Michael. Michael shared, "I need to work, but I also love to work. This job has boosted my self-esteem and confidence. This is my second act."
Julie, I'm curious, why is work important to you?
Well, I think the reason that work is most important to me is because it gives me an opportunity to contribute to my community in a meaningful way. I really like the work I get to do every day and feel grateful for that. How about you, Dustin?
Well, I guess work is important to me because it gives me time to think and be creative. It also gives me the opportunity to spend time with people that I enjoy, like you. So, like I said, I'm a little bit nosy, and I think it might be fun to hear from the audience some examples of why work is important to them too. So if you would like to share examples of why work is important to you, please type a brief response in the Q&A box. We would love to share some more examples during our first break. So now that we know the unemployment rate for people with disabilities is double the rate for people without disabilities. Julie, why might that be the case?
Dustin, people with disabilities report their biggest barrier to work is not their disability or the work environment. It's the misconceptions others have about their abilities based on fears, myths, and stereotypes about disability.
And we debunked many of these myths throughout this webinar series. Julie, we know there are many workplace benefits to creating a disability inclusive culture. Do you want to share some of the benefits?
Sure. There are studies that show employing people with disabilities can lead to many benefits in the workplace, like improved productivity, increased morale, reduced turnover, and higher profits. And employees with disabilities offer a variety of perspectives for problem solving, innovative thinking, and performing work. So when an employer cultivates a disability inclusive culture, they are more likely to attract qualified candidates with disabilities for their open positions and retain a qualified and experienced workforce. It makes sense that employers want to create the type of atmosphere where all employees feel welcome to bring their whole selves to work and share their unique contribution.
Julie, OOD has a variety of resources available to support employers who are interested in creating inclusive workplaces. First, there is the Inclusive Employer Toolkit that is on our website. Do you want to explain this toolkit?
Sure, Dustin. The toolkit was created to support employers who are creating disability inclusive and accessible workplaces. The toolkit begins with discussing the business case for disability inclusion and then is organized into 4 main topics, which include inclusive workplace, recruiting, hiring, and supporting employees, workplace accessibility, and workplace accommodations. Each of these sections include helpful information, fact sheets, and webinars related to the topic. And our business relations team is featured throughout these sections, so employers can easily find our contact information and reach out to us. We're always happy to help.
Thank you, Julie. Using the Inclusive Employer Toolkit as a baseline, we developed the Inclusive Employer Handbook. This is a 5-part webinar series focused on creating and sustaining a disability inclusive workplace. Each session had a different topic related to a section of the toolkit. These webinars are archived on our website, so anyone can access them when they are interested.
Yes, and Dustin, each includes a helpful fact sheet and a learner's guide that includes additional information and resources.
We also offer disability awareness training. So our business relations team can provide these no-cost trainings to support employers to create inclusive workplace cultures. Throughout the Employer's Reasonable Accommodation Handbook, we have been including excerpts from our disability etiquette training. There is a more comprehensive on-demand webinar on our website focused exclusively on disability etiquette. This training defines disability, addresses disability etiquette guidelines for various disability types, describes how to have respectful interactions with people with disabilities, and includes education on proper language usage. One more way that we can help support a disability inclusive workplace is through the workplace accessibility consults that you provide, Julie. Can you talk a little bit more about this?
Yes, Dustin, I can work with our employer partners one-on-one when they have questions and goals related to workplace accessibility and disability inclusion. A consult allows me to customize resources, guidance, and ideas based on the employer's unique workplace and goals. These are no cost and can be effective in helping employers take that next step in their journey.
That's a great point, Julie. Now, a participant with whom I work recently had an interview. And during the conversation, the employer phrased questions in an inclusive way, making sure to ask if tasks could be accomplished with or without a reasonable accommodation. Because of this, the student felt comfortable discussing her disability with the employer and how she would utilize accommodations to be successful. When employers know what they can ask of applicants or employees, when they can ask, and why, they create a workplace culture that is inclusive of individuals with disabilities.
You're right, Dustin, because getting this wrong could lead to legal concerns, but also could result in creating an atmosphere that does not feel inclusive of people with disabilities. I don't believe employers intentionally ask the wrong questions, but instead may not be aware of the guidelines of what they can ask, and just as important, when they can ask. Under Title I, employers can ask disability-related questions and administer medical examinations. However, the ADA limits when these are permitted by providing guidance for the pre-offer and post-offer phases of pre-employment and during employment. So we'll talk about this guidance shortly. Part of being a disability inclusive employer means being aware of this guidance so you can obtain the information you need when you need it in a way that is aligned with the law, which is an example of how employers demonstrate they care about all employees and what they need to be successful at work.
Julie, can you explain what a disability-related question is?
Yes, Dustin, a disability-related question is a question that is likely to elicit a response that discloses a disability or additional information about a disability. And so there are times employers need to ask these kinds of questions. However, the ADA limits when employers are permitted to ask. The guidance from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, gives us some examples of what a disability-related question is, like asking an employee if they have a disability, or asking them how they acquired their disability or about the nature or severity of their disability. Another example is asking an employee about their ability to perform major life activities, like asking if they can lift 50 pounds or if they can stand for 8 hours, or asking if they have ever filed a workers' compensation claim.
Julie, so this makes me wonder what questions an employer can ask that may not be disability related.
The EEOC guidance does provide a list of questions as examples that are generally not likely to elicit a response about a disability. Some of the examples provided are more about our daily conversations at work, like asking in general about an employee's well-being, or asking an employee who looks tired or ill if they feel okay. Another example is asking an employee how they broke their leg or how they're doing after the loss of a loved one. These are generally not going to result in a disclosure of a disability. Other examples that are more work-related include asking an applicant if they can perform the job's essential functions, or asking an employee for contact information to use in the event of an emergency. These all are listed in the guidance as examples that generally would not elicit a response related to disability.
Julie, how is asking an employee how they broke their leg different from asking a person how they acquired a disability? Why is this permitted and the other is not?
The EEOC guidance indicates that employers can ask about impairments if the question is not likely to elicit a response about a disability. Not all impairments will rise to the level of being a disability. A broken leg is generally a temporary condition that does not rise to this level. So the question about how the employee broke their leg is permitted. What is not permitted is asking the person whether they expect their leg to heal normally or if they break bones easily. because asking these questions could result in the individual disclosing a disability.
Thanks, Julie. I'm not quite sure I know what you mean by medical examinations. Can you explain these and maybe give some examples?
Sure, Dustin. A medical examination is a test or a procedure that seeks out information about physical or mental health or medical conditions. The EEOC provides examples of medical exams too, including a vision test that is analyzed by an ophthalmologist or optometrist, a blood pressure screening, a psychological test designed to identify a mental health condition or limitation, a nerve conduction test, like a test that screens for susceptibility to injuries like carpal tunnel syndrome, and procedures like X-rays, CAT scans, and MRIs.
Julie, can you elaborate more on how an employer can determine an exam is a medical examination?
Sure, the EEOC provides factors employers can use to consider when they're determining whether a test or a procedure is a medical exam. These include whether the test is administered by a healthcare professional or interpreted by one, whether the test is designed to reveal a physical or mental health condition, whether the test is invasive, whether it measures the ability to perform a task or measures the employee's physiological response to performing the task. Like if a test is created to measure a person's ability to lift items repetitively and then a blood pressure reading is taken. And a few more examples include whether the test is normally given in a medical setting and whether medical equipment is used.
Julie, there are employment tests that aren't medical examinations, right?
There are, Dustin. The EEOC guidance indicates there are tests and procedures that generally are not considered medical exams, and they do provide some examples, like tests that determine the current use of illegal substances, physical agility tests to measure the ability to perform the job, physical fitness tests, which measure the performance of physical tasks like running or lifting, as long as these tests do not include exams that could be considered medical, like measuring heart rate or blood pressure. Also, tests that evaluate the ability to read labels or distinguish objects as part of a demonstration of the ability to perform actual job tasks, and psychological tests that measure personality traits like honesty, preferences, and habits.
Okay, Julie, let's discuss when each of these can and cannot be asked or requested. What about during the hiring process? Can employers ask disability-related questions or request medical exams at that point?
Dustin, it depends on what phase of the hiring process the employer is in. During the pre-offer phase, employers are not permitted to ask disability-related questions or administer medical exams. This includes everything that occurs before a formal offer is extended, like application forms, interviews, testing, and background and reference checks. It's also important to know that during this phase, employers are not permitted to ask a third party any questions they are not permitted to ask the applicant. Some examples of third party include service providers, a state agency, or an applicant's friends, family, or former employers. But in the post-offer phase, which is after a formal job offer is made and before employment begins, the employer may ask disability-related questions and require medical exams, as long as this applies to all candidates receiving a job offer in the same job category. Now, if these questions or exams screen out a candidate with a disability, for example, if a disability-related inquiry or medical exam shows the candidate has had several re-injuries to his back performing similar work, these questions and exams do have to be job-related and consistent with business necessity, and reasonable accommodation should be considered.
Julie, why is there a distinction between the two phases of the hiring process?
Dustin, this distinction is intentional to help ensure that hiring decisions are based on whether a candidate is qualified for the job without consideration of a disability. This two-phase process is set up for employers to first determine the candidate's ability to meet the job's qualification standards and perform the job's essential functions. If it's necessary to ask disability-related questions and administer medical examinations, these have to wait until the employer has determined the candidate is qualified and makes a formal job offer. And again, this must apply to all candidates in the same job class.
Julie, do you have an example of disability-related questions employers might ask during the post-offer phase?
Sure. The EEOC guidance states that after offering a job to a candidate, an employer can ask disability-related questions about an individual's workers' compensation history, prior sick leave usage, illnesses, diseases, impairments, and general physical and mental health. Any of these questions may result in a candidate disclosing a disability, which is why they are not permitted in the pre-offer phase.
Julie, let's go back to the pre-offer phase and share a bit more about what employers can ask candidates before they make a formal offer.
Dustin, during the pre-offer phase, employers are permitted to obtain the information they need to determine whether the applicant is qualified for the job. So employers are permitted to ask questions about the applicant's ability to meet job requirements and perform the essential and marginal functions of the job. For example, an employer may describe the physical requirements of the job, like maneuvering 25-pound boxes stacked on skids to a cart 36 inches high, and ask the applicant if he or she can perform this task with or without a reasonable accommodation. They can even ask all applicants to describe or demonstrate how they would perform job tasks with or without a reasonable accommodation. Questions related to non-medical qualifications and skills, like education, work history, certifications, and licenses are also permitted.
Okay, Julie, I think it's a good time to take questions and hear some of the examples from our audience members about why work is important to them. And just so everyone knows, we did receive some questions with our registration for this webinar, so we'll be weaving those in with questions in the Q&A box. But first, Julie, we have quite a few responses for why work is important to our audience members. And so I'm going to read a couple of those.
That's
Someone said that providing for their family is important to them, makes work important to them. Another person said a sense of purpose. Another person said quality of life and ability to provide for their family. Another person said it provides me a sense of purpose and a feeling of contribution, feeling of being a contributor to the community. Sorry, I forgot how to read today. And someone said, oh, like you, Julie, as an OT consultant in Michigan's VR program, they love helping people reach their goals, whether clients, businesses, or VR counselors. Their work is challenging and allows them to be creative. So like both of us, really kind of combines our two answers. Right. Someone said, work is important to me because it fulfills my desire to help others, giving me a sense of purpose and accomplishment. Someone else said, work is important to me because I am a single mama and I have to provide for my babies. Brittany said, work is important to me because it gives me a sense of purpose. It is a way for me to stay on top of my mental health and helps me feel confident in who I am. Those are awesome. I really like all the people who talked about providing for their family, which, you know, obviously I don't have the same kind of family that I think some people are probably talking about, in that I don't have children, so I have a dog, and Julie, as you know, she's recently broken a bone in her foot, and so I've been working to pay some veterinary bills throughout the past couple of months. So I can relate to providing for the family.
Yes, I can too with our two fur babies here at home. And I'd like to say hello to my friend in Michigan. I'm not sure which one it is, but thank you for attending today. And this is a great collection of reasons why work matters. And it makes the point that we illustrated before. There's a lot of reasons that we all enjoy work and value work.
Yeah. And actually, one more person since then has posted that work is important to them because it provides security and fulfillment in their life. And I think that's cool too. Like the security part of that answer is really great. So, Julie, we do have a question that was submitted with the registration for the webinar. So we're going to get to that. So an employee comes to a manager letting them know one of their staff was discussing medications taken with a coworker. And so this employee thought it was a controlled substance and reported it to the manager as a result. So what should the manager do in that situation?
So this is a really good question, because as an employer, sometimes you receive information about disability from a third party, not necessarily that you've observed something or that somebody has disclosed something to you. And so I just want to address that the guidance from the EEOC provides some factors for employers to consider as you are assessing whether that information you've been given from that third party is sufficient for you to move forward with asking a disability-related question or requiring a medical examination. So they give us 5 factors to consider. The first one is to consider the relationship of the person who's providing the information to the employee they're providing the information about. Second, you want to consider the seriousness of the medical condition that's an issue. Third, you want to consider the possible or potential motivation of the person who's providing you with this information, and think about how the person learned the information that they're sharing with you. Did they get that information directly from the employee, or did they get it from a third party? And then the final factor to consider is any other evidence that you might have as an employer that would bear on the reliability of the information that you were provided. So I think in this specific question, it highlights that there's a variety of times that employers might get information from a third party. And so what's important to know is your next step is then to consider this guidance from the EEOC as you, again, decide, is this sufficient to move forward? And certainly bring your HR team or your legal team into that conversation just to make sure you're handling that in the best way.
Great, thank you.
And I'd like to, before we move on, just thank everybody for participating and sharing why work matters. That adds to the webinar. So thank you for your participation.
Yeah, I realized I didn't say that before I asked that question. So thank you all. Another question in the Q&A box, Julie. While interviewing an individual with a hearing disability who speaks loudly, can you advise them to lower their voice?
Well, that's a unique question. I've not been posed that before, but if there's a reason that the voice needs to be lowered, I think that you could ask that. And if there's a reason that can't be accomplished, maybe could the consideration be that the interview happen in another room? Like maybe if you're in an area where that is disruptive to others in the environment, could you go to a different location? Maybe the location could provide some more spacing, where if it's the interviewer that the loudness is impacting, there could be some distance. So I would say you could bring it up and talk through what are some good effective solutions so that the event or the communications can still occur in a way that works best for everybody.
Great. And so one more question, and this kind of relates to the second half of our webinar, so I'm not sure, we might want to save it for the second half, but we're starting an ERG focused on disability inclusion at our agency. Where should we look, or who should we talk to about finding presenters or trainings for our various initiatives?
There's a lot of providers and organizations and entities in the community that focus on disability. There's us here at Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities, but there in each community there are folks. And so I would maybe tap into the members of your ERG who have some ideas and start to reach out to those communities to find out who might have the ability to come in-house. We could certainly talk offline more about what your goals are and see if we could make some recommendations. Maybe even reaching out with some kind of a survey on your intranet to ask the employees outside of the ERG if they have ideas of topics that they're interested in, and maybe different organizations that they'd like to hear from. So those would be some quick recommendations, and we will be talking a little bit about ERGs towards the end of today.
Yeah. So we're about to go into employee resource groups in this second half of our webinar. So hopefully we'll have some ideas for you there too. So thank you all for those great questions, and thank you again for sharing the reasons why work was important to you. That was a lot of fun. We're going to take another break before we finish, so please feel free to post any more questions that you have in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them at the end of the webinar. So Julie, employers also have questions about what they can ask on applications. Applications are a part of the pre-offer phase. How about we provide a couple of examples of what you can ask and what you can't? I'll provide what cannot be asked, and then Julie, you can provide an alternative question that employers are permitted to ask.
That sounds good, Dustin.
Okay, so the first application question is, how many days did you miss from work last year due to illness?
Dustin, an alternative question that is permitted would be, are you able to meet the attendance requirements of the job?
Here's another question that's not permitted. Is there a health-related reason you may not be able to perform the job?
Dustin, an employer could ask, are you able to perform the essential functions of the job with or without a reasonable accommodation? And remember, it's a best practice to include a reasonable accommodation statement on the application form that is easy to find.
Thank you, Julie. Before we move on to the employment phase of what an employer can ask and why, I wanted to cover one more step in the pre-offer phase. Do you have any tips for employers on how to make interviews disability inclusive?
I do, Dustin. One best practice is to provide training for employees who conduct interviews on topics like the pre-employment requirements of Title I of the ADA, disability awareness and etiquette, disability disclosure and confidentiality, and about the interactive process, including how to manage reasonable accommodation requests. It's also a best practice to remind interviewers to focus the interview on the applicant's ability to perform the job, not on disability. To help interviewers with this, inform them that they may ask all applicants, including applicants with disabilities, to describe or demonstrate how they will perform a job with or without a reasonable accommodation. The interviewer may also describe, demonstrate, or provide a written description of job tasks and ask if the applicant can perform these tasks with or without a reasonable accommodation. When an applicant has a known disability that could reasonably interfere with or prevent performance of a job-related task, the interviewer may ask the applicant to describe or demonstrate how this task would be performed, even if other applicants are not asked. However, the interviewer cannot ask about the severity of the disability, the condition that caused the disability, or if the applicant will need treatment or leave due to the disability. Now, if the known disability would not interfere with or prevent the performance of a job task, the employer can only ask the applicant to demonstrate how he or she would perform the task if all applicants in the job category are also asked.
Those are very helpful tips, Julie. So sometimes employers administer tests as part of their interview process. What are best practices for that?
You're right, Dustin. Employers may administer tests to determine job qualifications. If a test screens out an applicant with a disability, the decision must be job-related and consistent with business necessity. For example, a test that measures general qualities and not skills needed that are to do the job, this may screen out candidates with disabilities who can perform the job. An example provided in the Title I Technical Assistance Manual states that a standardized test that is given to all candidates for a position as a heavy equipment operator might screen out candidates with learning disabilities who can perform the functions of the job. Also, tests given to applicants with disabilities should be in a format and manner that does not require the use of a functional limitation unless the test is designed to measure that skill. For example, a candidate with dyslexia should have the opportunity to take a written test orally if the disability substantially limits the individual's ability to read. However, if reading is an essential function of the job, the employer could require the candidate take the written test. Reasonable accommodation would still need to be considered, and a possible solution could be to utilize a reader, unless the ability to read unaided is an essential function. It's recommended as a best practice for employers to inform applicants in advance of the test that will be given and include a reasonable accommodation statement so the applicant knows how to request an accommodation if one is needed.
Julie, what about an employer who administers background and reference checks?
There are questions employers may ask a previous employer when they are facilitating a reference check. Employers may ask about the job functions and tasks performed. They can ask about the quality and quantity of work output. Employers can ask about the applicant's attendance record and any job-related issues that do not relate to disability. Employers cannot, however, request information from another source about an applicant that is not permitted to be requested directly of the applicant. And a final best practice is that employers should ensure any outside agencies that they use to conduct background or reference checks comply with ADA requirements regarding pre-employment inquiries.
Thank you, Julie. Now that you've discussed the pre-offer phase and we previously discussed what happens in the post-offer phase, what changes when the candidate becomes an employee?
Dustin, at the point a candidate becomes an employee and employment officially begins, employers can no longer ask disability-related questions or require medical exams unless it's job-related and consistent with business necessity. And this applies to all employees, not just employees with disabilities.
Julie, what do you mean when you say it must be job-related and consistent with business necessity?
These are terms commonly used in Title I of the ADA and the guidance provided by the EEOC. Job-related means the inquiry or exam is related to a specific job and not a general class of jobs. And consistent with business necessity means these apply to the essential functions of the job.
So Julie, when might an employer encounter a situation in which a disability-related inquiry or medical exam is permitted during employment because it is job-related and consistent with business necessity?
According to the EEOC guidance, this requirement may be met when the employer has a reasonable belief based on objective evidence that an employee's ability to perform the job's essential functions is limited by a disability, or an employee poses a direct threat to the safety or health of themselves or others due to a disability. These questions and exams may also be job-related and consistent with business necessity when an employer is engaged in the interactive process and needs to verify the disability and/or the need for the reasonable accommodation because these are not known or apparent. The guidance also indicates that in limited circumstances, employers are permitted to require periodic medical examinations of all employees in certain positions, like those that impact public safety, to address concerns that are specific to that particular job.
Julie, do you have any examples?
I have some examples from the EEOC guidance. The first is about job performance. In this example, a tax auditor has completed a third fewer audits over a 2-month period than expected and has made several mistakes. During a low performance review, the employee discloses to her employer that she has lupus and recently started taking a new medication that causes her to be fatigued and makes it difficult to focus on work tasks. Based on this disclosure, the employer has a reasonable belief that the employee's ability to perform the job's essential functions may be limited by the medical condition. So in this example, the guidance says the employer may ask disability-related questions or ask the employee to provide documentation from her doctor to explain the effects the medication may have on her ability to perform the job. The second example is about direct threat. In this example, a crane operator who works at a construction site is required to hoist concrete panels that weigh several tons. There is a coworker who works on the ground to help load the panels, and then several coworkers assist with positioning them. During a break, the employer observes the operator appear to become lightheaded, sit down quickly, and have difficulty catching his breath. The employer asks him if he is okay, and the employee responds that this has happened a few times over the past several months and he is unsure why. So in this example, the guidance says that based on this objective evidence, the employer can reasonably believe the employee may pose a direct threat and require him to have a medical exam to determine if these symptoms impact his ability to safely perform the job. Now, in this case, it may be helpful for the employer to give the employee a copy of the job's essential functions and the physical qualification standards so the employee can provide these to his doctor to assist with making this determination. The third example is about periodic testing and monitoring. In this example, a fire department requires those employees with the essential function of firefighting to undergo a comprehensive vision exam every 2 years and an electrocardiogram every year because the department is concerned that certain vision and heart problems can impact the ability to perform the job safely. According to the guidance, these periodic examinations are permitted by the ADA. Now, if the outcome of the exam results in the employee not being able to perform the job's essential functions safely, the employer must consider reasonable accommodation before taking any other action.
Okay, Julie, how does the employer know when the job-related and consistent with business necessity standard is met?
Dustin, the EEOC guidance provides us with 3 instances when the standard may be met. The first is the employer knows the employee has a disability, has observed low performance, and can reasonably attribute the low performance to a disability-related limitation. The second is when the employer observes symptoms which indicate the employee may have a disability, that will limit the ability to perform the essential functions of the job or that will pose a direct threat. And the third is when the employer receives reliable information from a credible third party about an employee's disability.
Okay, Julie, what would be an example of an employer receiving reliable information from a third party?
Dustin, the EEOC provides this example. An employer was notified by several customers that one of their customer service representatives has made several errors on their orders. The employer has consistently received complaints that the same representative asks them to repeat information frequently and to speak louder. The customers report that after repeating the information, the representative often reads back their information incorrectly. Based on this information, the employer has a reasonable belief based on objective evidence that the employee's ability to process orders correctly may be limited by a medical condition, such as difficulty with hearing. The employer may ask the employee disability-related questions or ask the employee to take a medical examination to determine if the employee can perform the job's essential functions.
Julie, let's review some frequently asked questions we know employers have related to disability-related questions in medical examinations. What should an employer do if an employee doesn't answer a disability-related question or complete a medical exam?
Dustin, the answer depends on what these are being required for. If the question or exam is related to job performance and the employee does not answer the question or complete the exam, the employer is permitted to apply its consequences for low performance as it would apply to any employee with low performance in the same job category. If the question or exam is related to the interactive process and the employee does not provide the requested information, the employer can choose to not provide the reasonable accommodation. The best practice is to communicate to the employee why are you requesting this information and only ask for the limited information you are permitted to obtain to move forward in these situations.
Julie, what about when an employee has been off work due to a medical condition? Can the employer ask disability-related questions and require medical exams when the employee returns to work?
Dustin, the answer is yes, if the employer has a reasonable belief that the employee's ability to perform the job's essential functions or to do so without causing a direct threat is limited by the disability or medical condition. And as we said before, the information the employer requests through the questions and exams must be limited to what is necessary to make the determination. Employers cannot ask for unrelated information.
Julie, what happens if an employer encounters a situation where another federal law or regulation requires them to ask questions that are disability related or conduct medical examinations?
Dustin, the EEOC guidance does not prohibit an employer from these when they are necessary or mandatory under another federal law or regulation. For example, there are safety regulations that require employees who drive buses and trucks between states to have medical examinations periodically, and also certain types of employees like pilots and flight attendants must continually meet medical requirements for their positions. Other laws that have requirements include OSHA, which is the Occupational Safety and Health Act, the Federal Mine Health and Safety Act, and there are others related to toxic exposures and hazardous substances.
Julie, one last popular question employers have is about questions and exams related to wellness programs. These are often about health and wellness and are voluntary. What guidance can you share with employers?
Dustin, you are correct. Many employers offer wellness programs as part of their benefits and privileges of employment. These are considered voluntary if employees are not required to participate and are not penalized for not participating. These often do include voluntarily providing medical histories and information, as well as participating in voluntary medical exams. The ADA does not prohibit employers from offering voluntary wellness programs and doesn't require the questions, collection of information, or exams to be job-related and consistent with business necessity. What the ADA does require is the employer keep the information it obtains separate from general personnel files. Some examples of what these programs may screen for include blood pressure, cholesterol, glaucoma, and cancer.
Julie, there are a variety of times that an employer may ask a disability-related question or require a medical examination. I imagine some of these instances may result in an employee disclosing a disability and requesting a reasonable accommodation. This results in the employer promptly beginning the interactive process. So can you review when an employer may obtain documentation and what the documentation can include?
Dustin, during the interactive process, employers are permitted to verify an employee has a disability and establish the need for the reasonable accommodation. When these are not apparent, the employer is permitted to request reasonable documentation. Reasonable documentation means the employer is only obtaining what is necessary to substantiate the disability and the need for the reasonable accommodation. This generally means the employer cannot request an employee's entire medical file because this could include information that does not pertain to the disability and the need for the accommodation. The EEOC guidance states that reasonable documentation related to verifying a disability includes information about the nature, severity, and duration of the disability-related limitation, the activity or activities the disability limits, and the extent to which the disability limits participation in work-related activities. Documentation is also reasonable when it addresses the need for the reasonable accommodation.
Julie, this seems like a good time to also review confidentiality guidelines.
Dustin, the EEOC requires employers to keep the information they obtain about disability confidential, no matter whether they receive this voluntarily from an employee who shares information or whether it's through a disability-related question or medical examination. The guidelines include storing the information in separate medical files, apart from general personnel files, and only sharing this information with designated parties when it is permitted, such as sharing information specific to implementing a reasonable accommodation with a supervisor.
Okay, Julie, now that we know what we can ask and when, let's talk more about why. We have had employers reach out to us with questions about self-identification campaigns. Such a campaign might ask employees to voluntarily provide information about their disability status for statistical purposes. Julie, can you explain some of the reasons an employer might implement a self-identification campaign?
Sure. Employers may utilize these campaigns for two reasons. The first reason being a requirement they have under a federal, state, or local law or regulation. For example, employers who are federal contractors or subcontractors who meet certain criteria have requirements under Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act. The other reason employers may ask candidates and employees to self-identify is to foster a disability-inclusive culture in the workplace. And of course, some employers may do this for both reasons, Dustin.
I agree. And I think because of that, some employers have questions about self-identification campaigns because they want to make it clear that they are using these to benefit employees with disabilities. Does the ADA contain any guidelines that covered employers must meet when implementing these campaigns?
Dustin, the ADA does speak to self-identification campaigns, and this is another time when it's important for employers to know what they can ask. The reason why this is important is because following the ADA guidelines does help to minimize legal risk, but also reinforces to employees that the employer cares about them and their workplace culture. So as far as what the employer can ask, the ADA states that inviting or asking candidates and employees to self-identify as having a disability does not conflict with the ADA when certain guidelines are met. These guidelines are included with the EEOC guidance. They include individuals who choose not to self-identify should not be penalized. The information collected from the campaign should be stored separate from other personnel files and cannot be made available or used for employment decisions, such as with hiring or performance. And specific language must be used in the invitation for individuals to self-identify. If employers are curious about what to include or communicate to all candidates and employees in a self-identification invitation, we did include a link in the Learner's Guide to an example of one that's provided by the United States Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, which is known as OFCCP.
Julie, we have talked often throughout this webinar series and today's session about creating a disability inclusive culture. One strategy to do this is to create an employee resource group, or ERG. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, can you explain what an employee resource group is?
Dustin, an ERG is a group of employees with a shared interest in the needs of a diverse group in the workplace, which means an employer may have a variety of types of ERGs. Our emphasis is on ERGs focused on disability. An ERG offers the group a chance to network with each other and find support from those who have similar experiences. So this can be a group of employees with disabilities, but it can also include employees without disabilities who have an interest in the needs of the group. An ERG can be helpful in identifying the needs and concerns of the group, and then through its activities and efforts, be effective in making positive changes in the workplace related to the group's needs. Ultimately, an ERG can be one more way an employer is able to create that culture where employees feel comfortable to bring their whole selves to work.
Thank you, Julie. Well, we know we have some employers here in Ohio making positive efforts with their disability-focused ERGs. So how about we share some of those efforts?
We do, Dustin. Nationwide Children's Hospital shared with us what their disability-focused ERG is doing. Their ERG is called Capable, and the group provides support and advocacy for employees with disabilities, employees who are caregivers or partners of people with disabilities, and employees who work with individuals with disabilities. Capable provides training to departments on topics like neurodiversity at work, inclusive hiring, and improving the patient experience. Capable partners with their executive sponsor and various departments to improve the access, acceptance, and support for employees with disabilities. Also, the group is working on quality improvement initiatives related to accessibility and accommodations. Capable hosts quarterly membership meetings and offers to meet one-on-one with employees to provide support and information on navigating internal processes. The ERG is closely tied to the hospital's Project Search program by supporting current and past interns. After Project Search's first year at the hospital, which was from 2021 to 2022, 80% of the interns were hired. The Capable ERG is excited to continue supporting and improving nationwide children's inclusion practices.
That's fantastic, Julie. And we also have an example from Key Bank. Their ERG is called Champions of Persons with Disabilities, or CPD, and they celebrated many successes in 2022. CPD supported Key Bank through partnering with external disability-focused organizations that included hosting hiring events for their fraud hotline and service center open positions. They provided a variety of training offerings, such as disability etiquette for their talent acquisition team and a mental wellness series, which addressed a range of topics like anxiety, suicide prevention, on-the-job stress, insomnia, and dealing with domestic violence. CPD organized mental wellness circles, which are voluntary and recurring discussion groups led by a therapist and focused on mental health related topics, challenges, and solutions. And to round off these efforts, CPD published its first newsletter in May and increased the ERG's membership by 34%.
That's wonderful, Dustin. Our last example is from Fifth Third Bank. Their Individuals with Disabilities Business Resource Group pillars are employee development, community involvement, and business innovation. Highlights of their BRG's 2022 accomplishments include celebrating National Disability Employment Awareness Month, which is known as NDEAM, with leaders across the bank to raise awareness of disability inclusion in the workplace. They also supported a disability services organization through volunteer work for the Over the Rhine International Film Festival. And they work to improve employees' access to the accommodation policy and process within their human resources technology platform.
Julie, those are great examples of the positive impact ERGs can contribute to the workplace. So let's take a break to see what further questions have come in. And Julie, I think there's two questions that might be kind of related, so I'm going to do these a little bit out of order, but what questions or known information could you reference for a former employee who was disability separated and reapplies for employment?
What questions or known information, sorry, this one I got to read again. What questions or known information could you reference for a former employee who is disability separated? And you know what, I would have to check with an HR team to get back on that one and answer that offline.
Okay. And then this next, the question two below it, Could the employer require a medical examination for an employee that was disability separated and later reapplies?
The employer require a medical examination. So in this situation, it sounds like you know the employee has a medical condition because they were disability separated. You'd have to have a reasonable belief that based on that, there is a reason to do a test. Remember, there's two parts to the hiring process. In the pre-offer phase, we don't do disability-related inquiries or medical examinations. So in the post-offer phase, if that's the phase you're in, you've offered the job, and you know the person has a disability or medical condition. You have a reasonable belief that they may or may not be able to perform the job's essential functions, or may not be able to do so without posing a direct threat. That's when you can consider whether it's appropriate to administer an exam.
Thank you. And there's actually a question, what constitutes reasonable belief?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a black and white answer for that one. We could look into the guidance to help you kind of tease out that situation, but that's not going to be an exact answer from the guidance, unfortunately.
Awesome. And then what advice might you give for being surprised in a phone interview by a candidate with a speech impediment so severe they are difficult to understand? How do we accommodate and treat the individual fairly if we can't communicate verbally, which would be a business necessity? If you're in an interview and the two parties are not able to communicate, you would address that in the moment to ask if there's another way that the two of you could communicate. And that may or may not be able to be resolved in that moment. It might be that we need to consider how to have this interview in another way at another time to see if there's a way to be able to communicate effectively. And if that impacts the job, then at some point the conversation about reasonable accommodation could be had as well to find out if that essential function could be performed in another way. Awesome. Thank you, Julie, and thank you guys for all those great questions. Here we are, Julie, at the end of today's webinar and also the finale of the Employer's Reasonable Accommodation Handbook webinar series. So what closing thoughts do you have? Thank you, Dustin. The focus of this webinar series was to build awareness with employers on best practices for creating disability inclusive workplaces and providing reasonable accommodations specific to various disability groups. We wanted to show that while often the process is the same, there can be unique aspects related to each type of disability. And so we hope we have helped employers to feel more comfortable when creating these environments and providing accommodations for their employees with disabilities. Today's webinar was a chance to discuss the guidelines and best practices for what questions employers can ask, when they can ask them, and why, as it relates to further fostering disability inclusive workplaces. Knowing and following the guidance is one step to impacting your culture. Some of the next steps employers can take are to utilize disability inclusion strategies proactively. So we shared ideas for providing disability etiquette and awareness training, utilizing a worksite accessibility consult, and facilitating an employee resource group. Each employer is unique, and so the next step taken to foster a disability inclusive culture will be unique to each employer. We hope we've inspired you to better understand the why behind your efforts. And please remember, our entire business relations team is here to support our employer partners along their journeys. So please contact us at any point along the way. We are happy to support you in any way we can. I'd like to sincerely thank you all for attending and for your interest in the Employer's Reasonable Accommodation Handbook.